welcome back. And I'm happy to introduce the next talk, which will be an artist talk. And welcome Barbara Carrasco, who sits here and is an artist and muralist. She graduated from University of California, Los Angeles in 1978, and later from the California Institute of the Arts in 1991. Since 1978, her works have been exhibited in the US and in Europe. In 2002, Carrasco was appointed professor at UC Riverside, and she's currently a board member of the Dolores Huerta Foundation. She received the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund Leadership in the Arts Award. Her work is included in the Radical Women exhibition currently on view at Brooklyn Museum of Art and in the Muralles Rebeldes exhibition at California Historical Society in San Francisco. So, help me welcoming Barbara Carrasco. The floor is yours.
Bear with me here, I have a little bit of a cold, so I might have to use okay, thank you. I might have to use some water in a minute. But I want to thank all the organizers of this symposium for inviting me to this important, I think it's wonderful so far, and I hope to contribute in a small way. I guess as a Chicana artist, which I have to explain that to you, I guess, because it's a politicized term. It was used primarily during the anti-war movement in Los Angeles, and also in 1968, the walkouts, where people were protesting the lack of a good education. So they, I mean, it's really amazing because all our parents were from here, also born in the United States, but not allowed to speak Spanish in the school system. My parents in particular were not allowed in the Texas school system. So we grew up, most of the Chicano artists I know don't speak fluent Spanish. We understand it, but don't speak it which is sort of is a shame, that we're not bilingual like so many people here are. But anyway, the term also was used, appropriated to affirm our identity as Mexican-American descendants, and also to reflect a movement, a Chicano movement that started with that, with all the protests and all that. But it's also about civil rights and also. As a feminist, I always felt like I had to really speak up for myself as a female, because I grew up in a traditional, not so traditional, but traditional Mexican family. Oh, wait a second, how do I do this? Oh, there, it's a red. Okay. Well, so in 1970, while I was still a student at UCLA, I did this piece. It's also in the Radical Women's exhibition. I want to thank Andrea, Giunta here, and Cecilia Fajardo for including it in a really important exhibit, Radical Women. I did this piece in one night. It's a lithograph. It's done on a zinc plate. I heard my brother tell his pregnant wife that she couldn't go to college, that she had to stay home and take care of that child. And I just was so upset that he said that. I said, wow, do we have the same mother? Because our mother is very strong-willed. She was a professional bowler, which is kind of rare for a Mexican mother. And so I did this piece, and I did not realize how powerful its implication was, and also how people interpreted it, because all these women from across different cultures and ages were really alike this image, and it also there's something that I didn't intend, but people did receive. Get the idea that it was talking about forced sterilization. And a lot of women in Puerto Rico, a lot of Mexican and Latino women were sterilized without their consent while they were young people. And then later on, when they were childbearing years and wanted to have children, found out that they had been sterilized when they were young. And I didn't even know about this situation until it actually happened to my mother. And so this is one of the, this exhibit, this is 1978 when I did this. Oh, wrong way. Uh-oh. Oh, that one. It's big. Okay, sorry. And then, but I met, while I was a student, I met, 19 years old, I met Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. He spoke on campus. He talked about representing or dedicating his entire life to helping improve the lives of the most exploited workers in America, which are farm laborers. And so I was this 19-year-old kid who heard this real Catholic speak, and I had been raised a Catholic. I went to Catholic school, and here I hear this guy who's the epitome of a Catholic speak about something so sincerely. I immediately after his speech, I approached him and said, "I'd love to work with you," and he said, "We need artists." And little did I know he worked me to the bone for the next 15 years. So. It was a lot of work. And then after I did Dolores, that Dolores portrait, I did that to honor her as a feminist, as a co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union, but I also did it because she's also a nurturer, and even though she's got 11 children that she birthed, there's also a lot of women like myself that she has nurtured over the years and has really given us a lot of advice over the years that we take seriously. The next person I wanted to honor was Antonia Hernandez, who became the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund president, and she was also the first lawyer who represented the women who were sterilized at USC Medical Center. And so some of these images are all based on my daughter, who's a weta like me. I did this kind of image usually they have, it's a reverse really when they ask black little girls, which Barbie doll you want, they usually go for the white girl with the blonde hair. But in my daughter's case, I raised her in a different way, and she wanted the dark Barbie doll. So, and then, so there's all these images that I've done. This is a book cover for UCLA publication, Essays a la Mujer, and it was different essays about the Chicana activism that was initiated during the 60s and 70s, and then some of the artists that I work with, they also work with all these different organizations. We never were paid adequately for our work. Same with the work I did for the United Farm Workers. No one was actually paid for their services. My mother was very upset about that because she said, "Well, you're a UCLA graduate and they're not paying you." And but she didn't understand the whole idea that it was part of a movement. So anyway, and this is a piece I did that's also in Radical Women. It's about censorship. Because I did a 16 by 80 foot mural, the history of Los Angeles in a woman's hair, and several scenes in the mural were censored by the city of LA. Let me see, that's it right there. It's 16 by 80 feet, so it's huge. There's a Japanese internment scene to the far right on the bottom, and it's a Manzanar guardhouse, and the city told me that the Japanese don't want to be reminded of the internment camps. And then I said to them, I said, well, all these are Anglo men that make up the CRA. And I said, well, none of you are Japanese. Let's go ask them what they think of this mural. And so they wrote very powerful letters of support that the reason why it should be in the murals, it's a reminder that it should never be repeated. So I think that's the great part about mural making is that it's an opportunity to tell a story, and it involves so many people. It involves community people, artists, lawyers were involved, and historians, and so it's just a big collaboration with so many people, and you learn so much and get so much out of the experience. And then at the same time, I was the editor for Chisme Arte magazine, which was a community-based arts publication where mostly Chicana and Latina artists got together and wrote articles and did images and photography related to the Chicana experience. And so this is a piece I did years ago about growing up in the government housing projects in Culver City. It's called Vista Gardens. But this is these are five, I think it's 12 by 2 feet paintings on acrylic with some mixed media added to it, so they're all different parts of growing up in the projects. They're, the different types of foods that we had were like all imitation foods like carnation milk and Tang, and it just sounds really. I was surprised that people. A lot of people don't know that experience, but kids who were poor actually came up to me afterward and said, "That's exactly what I ate when I was growing up in the projects." A lot of it was a pretty common story. So, I like doing pieces like that. And when Cesar Chavez died, this was the mural banner for his funeral. It's real simple. My work is real simple and direct. This piece speaks personally about being a güera. My grandfather told me if I could eat jalapenos, that would prove that I'm Mexican. It's all silly, but anyway, so I did this painting, and it's amazing that this painting did the same thing. A lot of people put it in different publications, and they really could relate to it. But I think the skin thing, that became a big issue with me because I have two sisters who are dark complected, and to grow up with them, I experienced racism through the way people treated them. Not so much directly to me, but my sister and I, who's 3 years younger than me, lived in the dormitories at UCLA, and so the Anglo girls would invite me to lunch, but not my sister. And I say, "What about my sister?" And they would be incredibly shocked that we were sisters. "Oh my God, you don't look like sisters." And anyway, but this is one of those pieces that does that. And these are the kind of banners I did for the United Farm Workers. This is a 30 by 30 foot banner that I did I think less than a week. But some of these unions, they're non-art unions, so they don't really take into consideration the type of how much time it takes to do these paintings this large. So I asked Cesar Chavez to come and see the process. And I think most of the people that worked with him before were a little nervous about saying anything to him like that. But I thought, well, I think it's a good idea for him to see. So he came to the North Unit where I was painting. It's on the farm worker headquarters, and he saw this group of people helping me, and their knees are red and they look tired, because there's no walls large enough for us to paint. So we were painting on the floor, and he said, "Oh, I get the picture. I get what you're trying to say, Barbara." And I go, "Well, if we had adequate notice, it would come out a lot better, and people wouldn't have to suffer so much." And anyway, but I did really enjoy working with him. I was very young when I met him, 19, and worked with him for 15 years directly. And in the end, he attended one of my press conferences in New York in 1989. My work was shown at Times Square. I don't have an image of that, but that piece was called Pesticides, and I had asked Cesar to show up at the dedication of that. It was an electronic billboard, and so it was about pesticides and farm workers. And so he showed up, and he was interviewed on NPR and told NPR that he had met me when he told the whole story. It was really wonderful. I had it taped. And I thought it was good, but the thing about working with him especially, is that I also felt like it was such a community effort. I mean, so many people work with him, even the people preparing the meals for the strikers. There were the people in the fields working. Everybody was a big family, very much a movement. But I don't see that so much now, except for the younger generation. There is a younger movement that I see that it looks very hopeful, and I hope it continues really, in a good way. But I don't know. I was going to say something about the connection here with Germany is that when I was a young student at UCLA, I saw a German expressionist show on the campus, and I really thought there was a connection between German expressionist painting and Mexican painting, especially with the Mexican muralists, Orozco, Siqueiros, and Rivera. Those three artists, especially Orozco, really had very similar style to the German expressionists. And I was just so excited to come here to see some more work here by the artists here in Germany, but also to meet all the other fellow present presenters. And anyway, thank you very much. I don't know what happened to all my notes. I just happened to be, and I'm sick too, so it's like, it feels like some I'm wearing some earmuffs or something. But anyway, I think that's, I did a really short one, huh? I don't know, sorry. I just couldn't help it. So I'll answer any questions if we're going to answer questions later? Afterward, okay.
So thank you very much. Yes, the next speaker is Esther Gabara. She's professor of Roman Studies and art history, and visual studies at Duke University. She's a specialist in modern and contemporary Latin American literature and visual culture. She co-directed the Global Brazil Lab at Duke University's Franklin Humanities Institute, supported by a Mellon Foundation grant between 2014 and 2017. She is the faculty guest curator of the forthcoming exhibition Pop America, 1965 to 1975, at the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio in 2018. I think it's still open, the exhibition? It's opening in October. She published the monograph Errant Modernism, the Ethos of Photography in Mexico and Brazil, which was published 2008 with Duke University Press, as well as numerous scholarly articles and exhibition catalog essays. We are very happy that you're here, so please come here and speak to us.
So is this the right level of the microphone? Yeah? Okay. So first I'd like to join Barbara in thanking all the organizers and the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to share the stage with someone whose work I admire so much. I'm also going to talk about, are we ready? Yeah, okay. I took the invitation very seriously, so this is something I haven't presented on, so we'll see. So this is Acaso hay otro orden? Shouts and Murmurs from the 1970s. I'm going to move this a bit so I can actually see my paper. Okay. I received the invitation to speak with you today with a combination of pleasure to be included and concern in that I found it very difficult to answer the questions posed in the invitation. So the initial formulation invited us to decolonize through the lens of feminism. I'm quoting the invitation. Through the lens of feminism, the conference aims to excavate the aforementioned historical moment, its contradictions, as well as its political and cultural specificities in order to emphasize and locate modes of resistance against patriarchal hierarchies and hegemonic forms of feminist identifications. So in this articulation, we, all of us, are involved in what we understand to be decolonial or decolonization, and I felt I may be able to work with you toward that. The invitation also invited us to find decolonizing practices within the feminist art of the period from 1960 to 1980. And here I'll quote the invitation again, to unveil the presence of multiple feminisms and their decolonizing subaltern positions. And that's the end of the quote. So I'm fascinated equally by the history of theory and the history of art, as much as the practice and theory of both. And this second challenge turned out to be much more difficult for me, for reasons I'll talk about today. So I'm going to talk, I chose to do the difficult rather than what I thought I could do more easily. It's scholars do this. So in the past few years, the language of decolonial thought and politics has swept like wildfire out of my home discipline, the discipline I was trained in, which is Latin American literary and cultural studies, and into the art world. Meanwhile, within Latin American theory and philosophy, decolonial thought has been the site of strong, even angry debates and contentious disagreements over its origin stories and proper protagonists. While I will seek to avoid the personal tone those debates have taken at times, I do think it's important to trace the emergence of the decolonial as distinct from post-colonial and anti-colonial and from revolutionary decolonization, and to reflect its many voices as the concept moves quickly into art theory, exhibitions, and history. The exhibition currently on view in the Museo Jumex in Mexico City, Memories of Underdevelopment, Art and the Decolonial Turn in Latin America, 1960 to 1985, curated by the museum's director, Julieta Gonzalez, is a fascinating case. I can't provide an in-depth analysis of the exhibition here, but briefly, she proposes to do something similar to this challenge posed to us today, to locate a decolonial turn, avant la lettre, in the work of artists from the region. She includes some of the best-known artists from that period, Artur Baggio, Antonio Caro, Cada, Antonio Gias, Eugenio Tipo, and Juan Downey, Dema Leltit, and more. Feminism is not the overarching drive of the decolonial project she delineates, but feminist artists are included in that trajectory. There is, though, a curious and productive tension that I see between the two sides of the exhibition title, the two sides on the either side of that colon. Between that title and the artists included, between its citation of the classic 1968 film of Cuban revolutionary cinema by Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, Memorias del Subdesarrollo, and the concept of a decolonial turn, which I think might be instructive for us today. Okay. The Cuban cinema of Memorias was exemplary of a moment and a place in the history of Latin American arts when the political decolonization project was central, when the OSPAL, the Organization of Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, made posters that promoted international alliances for the revolutionary decolonization of what was called at the time the Third World. This is not, however, the decolonial turn of the second half of the title, right? No Cuban artists of that Jumex exhibit, no Cuban artists were included, much less those of OSPAL. And the articulation of giro, or turn, in the title echoes a strand of decolonial thinkers, more located in the academy, with a history of linguistic, visual, and cultural turns. In her catalog essay, Gonzalez primarily cites my friend and colleague at Duke, Walter Mignolo, and classic essays on modernity coloniality by Quijano and Wallerstein that preceded the decolonial project that Walter Mignolo has articulated, his version in that multiple lines, right? It must be noted, though, that none of the artists in the exhibit who were included in the exhibit were educated in indigenous or First Nation or Pueblos Originarios or Afro-Latin American philosophies or aesthetics, which are central to the premise of the decolonial turn for Mignolo and other participants in decolonial thought that Gonzalez doesn't cite in that essay. There are artists who cite indigenous, incipient indigenous movements in the 70s, people like Antonio Caro, who reference those movements. So for me, the Jumex exhibition distills the challenge that was posed to us today. And part of the difficulty is embedded in the very history of the institutions that determine what we consider to be contemporary art, as much as what we determine feminism to be. And so in this presentation, I'll really just work through some of these debates, offering a view onto what I hope will be a politically aware and theoretically productive incommensurability between the terms at play, feminist, decolonial, and art. So I'm going to focus on that idea of a productive incommensurability among those three terms. I'll consider how feminist thinkers and artists, especially in the period from the early to the mid-1970s, set up foundational debates over decolonization and the decolonial turn in the context of major intellectual shifts in Latin America around the character of knowledge and then afterwards traced 2 contemporary interventions into visual culture that bring that project of political decolonization into the present. And I'm trying to be very consistent in my use of words decolonial versus political decolonization. So these were not always pleasant conversations, sometimes featuring raised voices and battles for the microphone, as famously displayed at the first annual Year of the Woman Conference held in Mexico City in 1975. Here, Bolivian Domitila Barrios de Chungara famously disrupted the conference to tell not just the foreign US and European women what they were missing about the conditions faced in the Third World, but more bitingly addressed the upper-class, Spanish-speaking, European descent women from Latin America. She took on, in a sense, the first world within that Third World. And as my colleague Jocelyn Alcott writes in her new book on the conference, Barrios de Chungara, quote, confronted the panel chair, Mexican feminist Esperanza Brito de Martí, to insist that calls for unity among the women present were simply another form of imperialism. Barrios de Chungara arrived at the Mexico City conference thanks in part to her participation in Jorge Sangines's landmark work of third cinema, El Coraje del Pueblo. You see her on the right, and this is a poster for the film. The avant-garde film combined historical photographs with restaged indigenous protests and the state massacres that silenced them, acted out by the real-life inhabitants of the Bolivian highlands. Barrios de Chungara reenacted her own real role among the women activists in what was called the Committee of Housewives of the Mining District, Siglo XX. It was this experience with the Amas de Casa, housewives, that weighed in on her interventions in the Mexico City conference, and she narrated her struggles in Mexico City in her testimonio, Si me permiten hablar, Testimonio de Domitila, una mujer de las minas de Bolivia, if you allow me to speak, a testimony of Domitila, a woman from the mines of Bolivia. Both film and book were explicitly part of the kind of revolutionary Marxist-Leninist decolonizing project figured by the Cuban revolutionary Ospal. They represent an early manifestation of these tensions between feminism, decoloniality, and decolonization. Now, as is characteristic of the genre of testimonio, Barrios de Chungara's story was filtered through the voice of Muema Visier. Like the director Sanginés, who was from a middle-class family from the city, Visier was a white Brazilian woman in exile from the military regime in power then. If Si me permiten hablar announces Domitila's voice in the title, Visier has stated that the idea to write the book was hers. The first and second editions from 1977 and 1978 list Visier, not Barrios de Chungara, as the author. Similarly, Sanginés is still named as the director as El Coraje del Pueblo. In the second edition of Si me permiten hablar, published just 1 year after the first, there's an interview between the two women, in which Barrios de Chungara herself responded to questions about her view of this relationship between Marxism, Leninism, and feminism as solutions to the challenges facing Bolivian women. She declares, quote, "But I think in this moment it is much more important to fight for the liberation of our people along with men, not because I accept machismo, no, but that I consider machismo to be an arm of imperialism, as is feminism. For that reason, I consider that the fundamental struggle is not the fight between sexes, it is a fight of the couple." Now, this is, like I said, there's going to be debates that I'm presenting here. So her view of this struggle is grounded in a heterosexual family with children as the primary unit, marked by a kind of moralism. Her first impression that she gives you of the tribunal in Mexico City is of blonde, she specifically says blonde, prostitutes and lesbians, these are her words, whose concerns are not her concerns. She calls abortion and prostitution real problems, but not the main ones. In her interview with Visier, Barrios de Chungara defends the process of the testimonio despite its limitations because she sees it as a potential of disseminating the knowledge about what she considers to be those real problems of third world women. She hopes that, quote, "they can collect the experiences of the people not only to elaborate intellectual theories, to elaborate foreign theories, but that it serves to let the people speak," end of quote. Now, what is that speech? For Domitila, she makes language a primary component of that hope. Just at the beginning of her prologue, Visier writes that Domitila's language was, quote, "that of a woman of the people with her own expressions, her localism, and her grammatical constructions marked at time by the Quechua language which she has spoken since childhood." Domitila herself first explains that Bolivians speak Spanish and then adds, a lot of people, among the peasants and miners, speak Quechua and Aymara. She also talks about artistic languages, aesthetic practices of weaving, dances, and music, and declares, quote, I'm proud to have Indian blood in my heart. She describes her father as indígena, Indian, who spoke both Andean native languages very well, correctly. So notices the correct grammar of her father speaking both Aymara and Quechua so well that she says she didn't know which ethnic group he belonged to. Domitila notes the lack of understanding of the professional women present in Mexico made her, quote, value the wisdom of my people even more, thus connecting these languages with specific non-European epistemologies. Now, Cristina Alvarez Pesco reminds us that San Ginés was the first Bolivian director to make a film in Quechua or Aymara. Ucamu was the first Bolivian film in Aymara. The title means it's like this, a word that later became the name of the filmmakers group founded by San Ginés. So here we have this paradox. Outsiders, San Ginés and Vicier's politics of decolonization signal the importance of indigenous voices and words, including them for the first time in hegemonic art and literary circuits. But in the 1970s, they still occupied the position of author of these works. They reveal an awareness of non-Western epistemologies continuing in Latin America almost 500 years after the conquest, but still themselves fit in within certain established hierarchies of authorship. That focus on indigenous languages and knowledge formations in the 1970s and the fundamental shift it represented in the very concept of philosophy can't be discussed without naming Argentine Rodolfo Kusch, from whom the quote in my title is drawn. Kusch created a field he named Antropología Filosófica Americana, American Philosophical Anthropology, grounded in indigenous epistemological, spiritual, and affective imaginaries. A key figure in the emergence of what we talk about now as decolonial thought, he published two major books in this same period at the beginning of the 1970s, Indigenous and Popular Thinking in America in 1970, and Negation and Popular Thought in 1975. The first dealt with Quechua, Aymara, and Chipaya philosophies, and the second develops a philosophy of popular negation through conversations with the Jujuy-born Criollo ethnographers. Kusch conceived of this American anthropological philosophy foremost as the rejection of coloniality, right? This kind of anti-colonial, and as a philosophy that thinks with rather than about popular, indigenous, and mestizo intellectuals. So this question, ¿acaso hay otro orden? Is there another orden? Could there be another order? Reflects his search for a form of philosophical judgment other than that of Western scientific structures. Quote, could there be another order, not that of reality, to lay the foundation for judgment? So San Ginés's combination of historical photographs and fictive reenactment can be considered related, another order, spoken in Quechua and Aymara, that is not reality and that makes history, knowledge, and liberated thought presence. Now, Kusch was no feminist, so don't go to Kusch looking for feminism, but he was part of this shift in the order of knowing, a search from moving from colonial to colonized subject, from reason and evidence to opinion, from fact to fiction, evaluations that still do overlap with certain feminist projects and has been important to decolonial thought. So I want to switch now to the third example of these projects from the early 1970s, which is Cecilia Vicuña's work, a dedicated feminist writer and writer of erotic poetry and committed socialist supporter of Salvador Allende. Vicuña was in England when the Golpe de Estado, which was supported by the US, brought the right-wing military regime of Pinochet into power. An artist book that Vicuña had begun as a commemoration of the triumph of Allende was transformed overnight into a work of mourning, titled Taste of Me, Sabor a Mí. The book was published by Bourges Press, an experimental mimeograph press run in Devon, actually, by Mexican artists Marta León and Felipe Ehrenberg, themselves in exile from the violence in Mexico after Tlatelolco in 1968. So Vicuña begins Sabor a Mí citing indigenous worldviews and aesthetic forms. Quote, according to American Indians, the whole universe is circular. See this on the left. A circular form she fills with Chilean and Cuban revolutionary flags. The revolutionary movement, to quote, to destroy reactionary ideas, bourgeois ideology, individualism, solemnity, all white European capitalist ways of existence, she writes, was connected to, quote, a revolutionary feminism that would give birth to a different relationship between men and women, neither power nor dependence nor oppression, the meeting of two complete universes. Vicuña's Latin American Revolution would combine, she writes, the wisdom of the American Indian woman with socialism to create a utopian Chile. She promises, quote, the Araucanos are going to rise up. They are waiting to begin to conquer their own way of existing, end of quote. So that other existing resonates with contemporary decolonial commitments by scholars such as Catherine Walsh to reexistir, re-exist, a practice that seeks el buen vivir, a good living, that Walsh and others understand to be fundamental to both pre-Columbian and contemporary Andean thought. Vicuña recalls a time in this 1973 text before this revolution in herself when she only knew foreign names, and she writes, cuando yo era colonizada, when I was colonized, a time before she learned the names and words of Araucano people and visual practices. She reproduces a photograph in the text, this is a new version, of a destroyed self-portrait, Black Panther and Me. This is a later remake. In celebration, she writes, of the beloved party from New York. Holding a birth control pill in her hand, Vicuña explicitly links her art, indigenous philosophies, and political resistance, the radical US Party for African American Rights, international decolonization struggles of the decade, and feminism. After this revolution, she writes, Chile would become, quote, the first totally happy country in the world. So that Chilean utopia is based on a series of acts of substitution, some that I find promising and some that I find a little just troubling. Vicuña writes, quote, Indians stop being Indians and abandon the highland towns, the donkeys and the desert. But I am going to become Indian, and I will take the houses and the donkeys, and I will go to the desert, end of quote. She narrates an attempts to read the petroglyphs of Atacama, drawn lines etched into the mountains and earth of the desert, and promises that, quote, some wanderers of the desert, instead of carrying books, will go from stone to stone reading the petroglyphs, end of quote. If the first substitution disconcertingly echoes a colonial act of displacement of indigenous peoples, the second promises the kind of replacement of colonial knowledge formations of the book that decolonial thought most broadly seeks to achieve. So what have we learned since 1975? What are the terms we need to respond to Barrios de Chungara's demands and to deal with Vicuña's substitutions? How do contemporary thinkers address the inequities and violence embedded in persistent yet unevenly distributed colonial formations of race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality? So I'm going to talk briefly, to close, about two theorists and visual practitioners active in the decolonial debates today. Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui of Bolivia and Gladys Tzultzul of Guatemala. Different generations and different backgrounds. Cusicanqui was born in 1949 to a Spanish-speaking mother of Aymara descent, and Tzultzul in the 70s to a Maya Quiche family. Both have engaged feminist thought and articulated their scholarship and political work more as decolonization or anti-colonial, as much as decolonial or decoloniality. Neither is a typically considered a contemporary artist. They do not primarily circulate amongst the institutions and histories of art associated with that term, but both have kind of been entering into that realm recently. Okay. Cusicanqui has published widely on what she calls the sociology of the image, in which the relationship between written word and image-based knowledge systems is fundamentally rethought from Andean intellectual and aesthetic traditions. If more recently she has written on and worked in photography and performance-based practices, she names the origins of her project in this moment in the 1970s, in a return to the countryside, revolutionary moments, her own learning to speak Aymara, and new non-textual sources of the decade, specifically naming San Ginés's film and Barrios de Chungara's testimonio. Sul similarly has expanded her social and political indigenous collectives to include photography and visual media. I must note that, quickly, Rivera Cusicanqui has published strong criticisms on, not just on US universities generally, but specifically on the one that pays my salary, okay? She's deeply suspicious of academic scholarship, nonprofit foundations, and art institutions in the North, so I'll include us sitting here in this room, which she just has described as engaged in recolonizing activities that use indigenous arts and people in their own economic self-interest, even describing them as a form of exploitation resembling 19th century rent collectors, the people who profited from indigenous labor and lands. So I think that also means that her vision of decolonial thought is strongly located in an ongoing project of political decolonization that demands its protagonists be involved in political, intellectual, and artistic practices in the South, even as it does include complex subject positions, including urban elites like Sanjines and mestizos, people of European and indigenous intellectual lineages like herself. Cusicanqui includes Sanjines among what she calls ventriloquists, which I find an interesting choice of words, who have made use of indigenous expression for mestizo and Creole interests, but nevertheless includes his films within a genealogy of political art and historical production that has been crucial to attempts to liberate Bolivia. I think I'm running, how am I on time? Am I too bad? Oh. 5 minutes, okay, I have to be a little quicker here. So I would direct you to a key concept for Rivera Cusicanqui in her photographic and collective pedagogy, which you see photographs of here, is La Conciencia Cheche. That is an Aymara word which is based in visual seeing and knowledge, and for her offers a photographic theory, a decolonizing epistemology, a theory of subjectivity, and a philosophy of history. And she does, you'll find this in numerous works of hers. She talks about it as when you see it from afar, it's a mottled gray, based on an infinity of black and white dots that unite in perception but remain distinct. So this gives her a way of thinking that is not dialectical, that she calls as an explosive and contentious force. And it is opposed to ideas of syncretism, hybridity, and the dialectics of synthesis. So in those black and white dots, they maintained separation, even as from perception they fuse. So she sees this as a way to get beyond rational thought, and she reaches out for Cheche in these practices of the everyday that she is involved in. That process, though, remains unresolved, incommensurable points of black and white that remain an energy grounded in contradiction. And she has, in a recent interview, adamantly connected the concrete nature of this knowledge with women's subject positions and with a feminized utopia. And that word utopia is still relevant for her, which I find interesting, although it's a different utopia. In the 2016 Symposium of Latin American Philosophy, Gladys Sul presented on what she calls communal projects of anti-colonialism, right? So the title of the conference offered decolonial and anti-colonial, and she chose to title her own presentation Anti-Colonial. She begins by underlining the important role of iconography and symbolism in Highland Maya life, something like this project that she also refers to by Cusicanqui called Amo la Montaña, I love the mountain. And Sul has created photographs and participated in videos about huipiles, the woven textiles in the highlands of Guatemala, which was eventually included in the 10th Central American Biennial with these 20 photographs. Now, both Tzutzil and Rivera Cusicanqui focus on weaving and woven objects themselves as women's structured modes of structuring knowledge. Huipiles and textiles are not just the content of knowledge, but rather another structure of knowing, the alternative epistemology that Julieta Gonzalez mentions in her essay about the decolonial turn. This is also, Cusicanqui relates to Cheche. The notion, she writes, the notion of identity of women is similar to a fabric. far from establishing the property and the jurisdiction of the authority of nation or people, the autonomous, indigenous, the feminine practice weaves the fabric of the intercultural. I'll skip that longer quote. But in the work with Tsul does with this collective con voz propia, with our own voice, Maria Victoria Chuy, part of this collective, explains the aesthetic, symbolic, epistemological, and ethical philosophies embedded in woven huipiles that the women make and wear. She talks about the 6 colors. It's a very complex aesthetic philosophy that she describes. So I'm going to have to briefly, I think, close with just how difficult it is to deal with, and I think the word that Marta Pérez Bravo uses was extraction from Palomonte. So it's very hard. So these are the images that the Colectivo Con Voz Propia produces. But even the video stills for the video about this project, which were created by a German videographer, in the moments when the camera is just working as a camera, produces these rather stereotypical images of the barefoot in the sandal and the close-up of the woman's waist and the breast with the Catholic saint. And I wanted to show you this quick set of images from Mexico that deal with this image of matriarchy that's been used by the state in Mexico in its own interests. A little bit what Cusicanqui was talking about, this kind of rent collecting from indigenous knowledge, right? So you have, from 1914, you have Herrán and Diego Rivera with their picturing of the women of Tehuantepec, one of these mythologized matriarchal societies in the southern Mexico, that women artists have also taken up as this genealogy. And this is not an attack on this is to show this, like, the embeddedness of the image of indigenous matriarchy as a source of artistic wealth and knowledge, but from positions that Domitila Barrios de Chungara was saying was distant from her, was not representing her interests, right? To the point that even the Tehuana, this is sort of just to make it really crude, the unnamed Tehuana woman, which was introduced as a 10 peso bill in Mexico in 1936 after a national competition for the design of the bill. That substitution still is a problem, even as certain forms of ventriloquism and relation may contribute to broader decolonization. In a recent study of settler Chicanos, what she calls settler Chicanos and Native women in the United States, Latina scholar Amy Carrillo-Rowe proposes that incommensurability itself may be the only site where those relations may be sustained in a feminist project. Aymara terms such as cheche are the anchors of Cusicanqui's building practices to decolonize politics, epistemology, aesthetics, and feminism itself from the problems that Barrios de Chungara signaled. And their untranslatability is as important as her explanation and performance of them. Tsul has referenced Cusicanqui's work on such indigenous symbolic and graphic worlds, suggesting that they offer a means of conceiving perhaps a pleasurable rather than schizophrenic shape of such knowledge. Or in my understanding, the black and white of cheche and the colors of the huipil are incommensurable, discontinuous, even as they form an exquisite fabric of life practices. That fabric of knowledge includes specific practices of weaving, self-governance, and communality, and are the material of a feminist politics. However, not just anyone can make, wear, and understand the huipiles, especially here in the global north. So following Tsul and speaking of them in front of you, I will simply call their textiles and their knowledge anti-colonial. Thank you.